Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is the feedback round for the Zelda Redesign submissions. So the ones that I'm going to go through is Zant by Daniel Jacob, Ganon by Jonathan Coit, and Desert King Ganon by Matthew Miller. So let's go ahead and kick it off with Daniel Jacob's Zant. Okay, so here is the character named Zant. This was done by Daniel Jacob. And the thing is, in the video, I put him as Zanto with like an X because that's how Daniel submitted him, and I honestly just didn't know the character. I've now since looked up the character. In the English version of Twilight Princess, his name was Zant, just Z-A-N-T. In the original like kanji, he is, or the katakana, he is Zanto. So that's where Zanto with an X comes from. Every time I looked it up, it was from the French version, so maybe that's a French version name for him or something. But anyways, this was the design that Daniel did. I included it in here because I thought that it was really cool just in general. I like a lot of the changes that were made to Zanto's original design. Daniel also mentioned in his email to me that this character, his version of this character, was also inspired by my A Village Corrupted stuff. So it's kind of interesting that it's a fusion of what I did with Link, but then also some influence from something else that I had done. So as far as this design goes, I think that it's pretty interesting. I think that for matching the look of my original Link, I think that it does a pretty good job. When we look here, the lines are very similar to the way that I do lines in my redesign of Link. The coloring is also very similar. You can see it's basically just like one key shadow with then a rim light here that's sort of going down the side. It is inconsistent in spots, so I don't think that it matches a single light source very well. For instance, let's turn that off for a second. If we look at this maybe as being the light source, let's say that it's casting onto Zant in some way, even if it's not this, but we've got sort of a general just coming from the top kind of light source going on. We have shadows here that make some amount of sense. So let me just fill that in. That makes some sense. Let's get a smaller pencil here so that we can really outline it. If we've got this hard ridge, let's get it bigger. We get this hard ridge of the nose, and the light is hitting like this brow and sort of top of the nose thing. We've got a cast shadow here, and that makes absolute sense, as well as the cast shadow that we've got here going onto his eyeball, where I think that there are some opportunities to make this stronger is also in a cast shadow underneath that eye, maybe following that same direction and having the cast shadow from the ear be back here, as well as respecting the shape of the head and having a cast shadow back here. So if I just quickly sample the shadow that we've got underneath the chin, and we just sort of go like here, and we find something nice there. I feel like that starts selling that directional lighting a little bit better. We can also have a cast shadow. Actually, let me grab this since I'm not working with a multiply. We can also have this cast shadow there because his head casting it onto his collar. And then there's other examples of that kind of throughout. So for instance, I would argue that we've got more lighting hitting the collar here. Let me just fill this all in and then go back in with a shadow. So we've got that all being lit, but then this is the part that's getting hit with the shadow. And then you can also extrapolate out where this piece is going to hit and maybe say that like, yeah, it blocks it. The light gets blocked there in some way, but that the light is still hitting here in a big bad way from the light source, either being the orb or coming from a more general spot. So if we're turning that on and off, you can see what we're doing there with the lighting to try and get a little bit more consistent. Same thing is true with his sleeve. So if we come back here and we look at this right here, if his light source is coming from here that shadow would be wrong. If it's coming generally from here, that shadow would be wrong. If it's coming from this side, the shadow is correct. But then we have some issues with why there isn't a shadow on this side of the body. So I think really here it's just about lighting consistency and making sure that that is on your mind the entire time. As for the design, I like the inclusion of these belts. I'm a big belt fan. I think that characters like Lulu are super dope. So I think that the belts are really cool. I also like that they feel like the belts that are on my Link redesign, as well as feeling a little bit like that A Village Corrupted vibe. Now, something where I think the design is, I don't know if this was on purpose or if it was a mistake, but I want to reference this as well, is here's my Link that I did. So what is something that's a little bit weird about this? I've already resized my Link properly to be the right, whoops, wrong layer, to be the right head height. So you can see there, we've got a loose, here, let's get a new layer going here. If we circle Zanto's head, line it up to that, so you can see just doing a perfect circle and then saying like, yeah, that's the height from chin to top of head. I know he's making that like O face and that would stretch out your jaw a little, but I mean, we're approximating here. We're not trying to be super scientific. And then we turn on Link and we get Link. That's about correct. If we put this over here and turn off this other layer that's occluding things, so we've got the curve right here, feels like it's hitting the top, and this and the bottom, you can see it's hitting the chin. So if we go with this being the right size for Link, that makes Link super small in comparison to Zant. Now, is that on purpose or is that like an error? I think it doesn't actually matter in this case, unless of course there's a really specific reason why you would want to do this, because I think that Link, or I should say a specific reason why you wouldn't want to do this, because I think that Link looks awesome like this. I think that him being that small next to Zant is really interesting. And when you even look at the hands, the general hand size of Zant with the general hand size of my Link, I think they actually line up quite well. Maybe Link's feet are a little bit small. It's kind of hard to say because Zant has these, in this design, he's got these big heavy metal boot things going on here. So his foot, I mean his foot is technically this part, right? So let's outline that. So if his ankle's a little bit turned and he's in like this really weird pose, like that's still a little big compared to this. But you know, as far as the slight flexibility of the size of characters and how you're playing with their proportions, I think that it's basically in line. And I think that that's really cool. Like the idea of Link running up, this version of Link, and he's got that big backpack on, and he's got a sword, and then he's battling with Zant, who is really tall and lanky. He's very like Voldo-esque. I think that that is really cool. So in general, the reason why I wanted to like look at this design for Zant was because I just thought that it worked quite well with the Link and the head size to Link, and then the fact that that makes him just so much taller than Link and so much narrower as well. I thought that that was just like a really cool thing. His shape then becomes like very rectangular overall, which when you compare that to this version of Link, I mean, if you carve out just Link himself, he's rectangular, obviously not as long, but right now like his shape language is much more of like a fat rectangle, almost a square, and I think that that's a really cool juxtaposition between the two. So this was Zant by Daniel Jacob, and I think it's a pretty dope take on the character. So now we'll move on to Jonathan Coit's take on Ganon. I wanted to specifically address this one for a number of reasons. One, I think that it doesn't match the style, but I do really like the design. I think overall he's got a really cool vibe. I like the different shaped sword that I just feel like you normally don't see Ganon with. Maybe you do and I'm just not aware of it, but I feel like that's the case. I like the scars. I like that that matches my Link. I think that that could be potentially cool, and maybe it's even something that could be story driven in some way. I mean, right now they're just sort of random scars all over him, so I don't think that that would be story driven, but you could potentially do something like that. I do like this weird purple shield, this like sort of energy shield. I like it. I like that it's a triangle. I just think that's a really cool shape to compare to the rest of him. And I also like just the vibe that he's almost got this like rogue-like, it's almost like he's like an undead rogue from World of Warcraft, but Ganondorf as an undead rogue, kind of. In the fact that he's got this color palette, he's got these cool ripped and torn things. He looks like he's a little shadier than normal. He doesn't really look like he's particularly regal, or that he really that he even thinks highly of himself. He kind of just looks like he's like an outlaw, and I think that's cool and could potentially really merge with the Link that I did, because the Link that I did was a bit more of a wanderer traveler type, and I like that this guy also looks like he could be wandering from out of town, and he's maybe dangerous or something like that. Like he's a bandit, and a bandit who maybe has come upon power, which is what we're seeing here. Maybe that's specifically referencing like the Triforce or an evil Triforce or something like that. And maybe he's like that classic idea of the sort of mongrel outlaw type who stumbles upon a power and becomes kind of horrible, which I think is neat. Now, as far as the style is concerned, let's start into one of the easiest things to look at, which is head height. I've already pre-sized Link, so here he is right here. Again, let's do a circle. Now, Ganon has a very weird head shape here, so I was sort of approximating based on the fact that he's got this weird head shape. Let's actually pull this a little bit tighter. So let's say that that's roughly his head shape, but he is very goblin-esque here. And then let's compare it to Link. So Link, my Link doesn't have quite that size head. If we were to maybe make it a little bit more of a circle, it gets a little bit closer, but I think that this is approximately the right head height. And I think that feels really good. I think that when you compare that to Ganon, you could imagine, you know, Link running up and battling him like this. You could even maybe imagine Ganon being, if I'm just going to sort of just make up story, maybe he's smaller and weaker and a little bit more thief-like, and then he gets the power and becomes a little bit stronger, which could even be part of emphasizing his like very small legs that we have going on here, which is kind of cool. Now, as far as this not really hitting the style, I would say that it doesn't hit the style in some major ways. So let's, whoops, wrong layer. Let's lower the opacity in this. By the way, I'm doing these real time, so if you hear my kids scream in the background, I can't really do much about it. But anyways, if you look at my Zelda, or excuse me, my Link, that's like an awesome faux pas. Here's my Zelda, everyone. This is Zelda. Just kidding, this is Link. He's got harsher edges all around. We've got, you know, super pointy ear. We've got this fairly chiseled part of his jaw. When we come down to his chin, it's rounded, but then it kind of sharpens off a little bit right there. We also have examples all over of cloth being really sharp, like that and that and that. These are all obviously natural instincts of mine, so when somebody is matching this style, I understand that it won't be perfect without a lot of practice, but you know, that was kind of the point of this, was to try and match style, which can be very challenging. Even on something soft like this sleeping bag, you can see that we've got sharper edges going on there. So that, I would say, is one of the biggest things that is missing from the Ganondorf here, or the Ganon, I should say. I don't know if he's Ganon or Ganondorf. That's always been a little fuzzy to me. But like, for instance, if I were going to do this, I would probably, in order to keep this type of like harsh edge that we've got going on with his chin, this sort of like, you know, big, almost like Hellboy type jawline, I would probably sharpen that up a little bit. I would probably also find some opportunities for just a little bit more shape in there that sort of communicates a little bit more of what might be going on. Maybe not necessarily both bigger teeth, but I would maybe emphasize that one is a little bit bigger than the other. And then also for his nose, I would, because of my sort of obsession with emphasizing planar geometry, I would probably do something where I'm kind of emphasizing this a little bit. Now, I think that I want to stress that this isn't right or wrong. This is just about matching the style. So this nose that is in the original one is absolutely fine. It's just about matching the style. So because I've got this like down, up, down arc, I don't want to mimic that when I'm going back the other way, because that starts making this look crinkly, right? Like this almost looks like a Jack Frost type character. So that's why my natural inclination would be to bring it back sort of straight to reinforce the structure that's happening here. This starts feeling more structured than it would if it had that crinkly thing. It would start feeling just like it was like this weak, flimsy lightning bolt type nose. So that's what's going on specifically here. Whoa, my eraser is huge. Let's bring this down. And then so for the nostril, I think that it's totally fine to have a down pointing nostril. I think that I like to indulge in emphasizing some of that structure. So I try to turn up that nostril if I can, but that doesn't mean that it has to be. That's less of a right and wrong and more of just a what I would do. Now we have this anatomy going on with his head, where he's like very sloped back. You can see that here. He gets pulled way back. That's not my shape language. That's not normally what I would do for shape language, but I think it's cool. But just for the sake of trying to ride the shape language we've got here, but then bring some of the style back into it, you could definitely keep this thing that we've got going on here with the eye socket, but I would bring this maybe something like that, try to get like a harsher line out of that cheekbone. Another thing that could be done is we could forget the in cut there and we could just round that whole thing off and fill out his skull shape a little bit, which could be cool. Depending on what I'm drawing, I almost always leave this curve out right here, this part of your cheek that creates that. I think that it's just something I leave out of my style a lot of the time. But you can start seeing here, I think, that with changing just a few of these choices, we can start getting something that feels a little bit more like the style that we've got in the Link, I think at least. Let's quickly go a little further into it. Get something going on here, maybe add a little bit more of that puffiness, and then find some points here in the hair, in the eyebrow hair. And then have this come over and start completing some of these folds that we see around the bridge of the nose. Real quick to reference the hair, like here, I mean it depends on the piece, but I think that something that matches really well with the Link that we have here is this idea of like we still have the point, but we have still a full lock of hair that goes into a point, and then it is rounded off in the bottom. So like for instance in like traditional sort of anime hair, you have much more of like this type of a thing, depending on the anime you're watching, of course. And then what we've got here, we've got more of a rounded, like which would be more of like maybe a Western animation type route you could take for the hair. So if you sort of combine this one and this one together, you get something that's a little bit more of like a full lock, and you can also kind of achieve that from this little dip we've got here. So it's not this kind of a curve that's like perfect. It comes in and then curves out just a slight bit there. And so if we're doing like a smaller lock of hair, it'd be like that, and you can see right there that dip. It's like leaves, you know, that type of a thing. So the last thing that I would probably change that is about the facial anatomy here is I would really emphasize a symbol over a actual form potentially. So what I mean by that is we would do like something like this perhaps to drive home the angry eye, maybe with that. So, and what I mean when I say symbol over actual anatomy, let's turn off the original real quick just so we can see. So see, that's what I'm talking about right there. And so what I mean by symbols versus actual anatomy is like, if you know the actual anatomy of an eye, you of course know that there is an eyeball and then there's like an upper lid that goes over the top of it, and then there's a lower lid that wraps around the bottom, and those curve in around that ball, that sphere. Let's do this for context, and then, you know, it goes out into Eyebrow Town, and then down here we've got the lid folds down here, and then we've got like the bag underneath there. So that is knowing the actual anatomy and finding a creative way to represent that. So if we like lower the opacity on that now, we can just find sort of like the parts that we want to bring out about that and emphasize them for the purpose of the illustration that you're doing. And that is essentially the root of stylization. You understand the main thing that you're trying to achieve from a realism perspective, and then you're deciding what information you're going to represent differently or what information you're going to leave out, right? A symbol is when you know that, like, this is an eye, or this is an eye, or this is an eye. Symbols are something that we rely on to do things really quickly, right? Like, we can just do this and we know that that person is perturbed. So the idea there is that sometimes we deliberately choose to represent things with symbols because we know that it communicates things really, really quickly. Symbols are bad if you don't really understand what you're doing underneath them, because that means that you might not be able to represent your eye in lots of different scenarios. Like, for instance, what is this eye when it's in the side? Well, there's sort of an easy answer, which is the symbol of this, right? But how do we get the symbol of that? Well, we get the symbol of that because we try to interpret this as being all of the anatomy around a half-closed eye and what that means. And then we say, well, what happens when I rotate that? Well, if I rotate that, it rotates into something kind of, whoops, that's bad, kind of like this. And that is how we start trying to solve what those symbols are. But if you just learn the symbol, you may not be able to manipulate that when you have to do something more extreme. So the last thing that I just want to point out for Jonathan here is about anatomy and about the structure. So take this for what it's worth, because for whatever you think it's worth, because for me, I love this cartoony style that we've got going on here, and I even abhor using the word cartoony, but unfortunately that's kind of the most applicable word. Let's just say the style that you've got going on here is, I think it's really fun and I like it quite a bit. However, I would be careful with your anatomy, because the anatomy falling apart can lead to structure falling apart, and I want to encourage you to pursue structure. So for instance, when we've got this arm here, what we're implying, or I should say what you're implying, is something kind of like this. I'm trying to kind of follow what's going on there. And then we've got this coming up here into the pectoral muscle right there. Even when you're doing something that's really stylized like this, it's a good idea to try and make sure that your forms are still really solid, because that's just going to help kind of everything. It's going to help everything feel a little bit more touchable, like it's got more dimension. It'll react better in the world. So I would recommend looking at cleaning some of this up. For instance, let's just say we're coming from up here. So let's say this is where his neckline is. Let's say his neck is something like that. Well, we come down from here and we've got the deltoid, which it could reach down there, but that's really starting to pull. And then we've got the bicep, which should come much more up to here. And then we've got the deltoid like that wrapping around. And then the pectoral muscle comes out of that. And so by cleaning up some aspects of this anatomy right here, we can start getting a little bit more structure. Also, depending on how you really want to handle this tricep back here, it might cut in a little bit, have like a more definitive elbow, and then maybe somehow do something like this for our forearm muscles right there. And this is me trying to sort of take on your style as well as bring in some of the anatomy, because we've got the wrist rounding off right there, and then this thumb is pretty extreme, but you can probably work that around a little bit there. And then figure out your knuckles, because right now your knuckles sit right about there, but these fingers would technically end, like the little gaps in the fingers would end right there, and they wouldn't necessarily go into the knuckle kind of like that. So, you know, just some basic foundational things I think will help out with getting this figure to really read. And I think that also happens in your fist over here. I think this could get reconciled a little bit more nicely. And then your plane that the character is standing on. Right now these feet don't feel really planted, and I think that by getting a little bit more structure and identifying, like, okay, where's my waist? He's got a particularly long torso. Get the knee in there, and then when we come down to where these feet land, it's like, what's the actual plane that we've got him on? Is it like that? Is it like that? Is it maybe straight flat across? Let's go with something that's a little bit more like that, in which case I would recommend just trying to get a little bit more of where that ground actually is in there. In fact, I wouldn't even go with that. I'd probably flatten it out a little bit more and have him just a little bit more firmly planted so that we can see how strong his stance is. Also, most people don't usually stand with their both feet like that, pointed outward, so I would even have the side that's facing us come a little bit more towards us, not quite that towards us because we don't want it to flatten out, but something like that. And then this one can keep doing what it was doing, where it sort of goes out to the side. That just feels like his stance is a little bit stronger there. But that's basically it. So it's a lot about bringing it's a lot about the idea being awesome, and then bringing the style a little bit closer and working on some of those structure aspects. And last we have Matt Miller's Desert King Ganon. This one is the one that I thought matched the style the most, probably out of all of them. I think that the line quality is very similar. I think that the palette and the shading style is very similar, and I think the proportions are very similar as well. And then of course Matt also went so far as to replicate this vignetting thing that I have going on in my Link piece. So pretty good overall. It's also the turpentine brush, it looks like, from Procreate, which is exactly what I used for that. So let's start talking about what I think is successful here and what could also maybe use a little bit more work. So I think the things that are really successful is the line quality. I think when you look at that, compare it to Link, it's very similar. I think that the shading is also quite similar. It's done with a soft brush. I think that there are some opportunities in here where it could be hardened so that it looks a little bit better. For instance, if we sample Ganon's skin here, and I'm going to use a soft brush so it can make it work the right way. If we hardened up some of this, it creates a little bit more of a cut there, because what we're looking for is we're always looking for a nice blend between our hard and our soft shadows to give form. That's like a great way to emphasize the form. And for instance here, where we've got this shadow bleeding over, let's let me point it out. It's right there. Let's sample this. And he's got this highlight here. I'm going to go right over the highlight for a second here. We're going to just wipe all that out so that we get this slightly harder edge where the bicep is. And let's go to a soft eraser as well. So that gives us this round softness that we have in the deltoid here, this right there. And then we have a hard hit where the light is hitting the top of the bicep. And so that's creating a nice hard shadow on the bottom side of it, and then a nice soft rounding shadow on the top, so that as it comes up this way, we're really selling the shape of that deltoid, that it's coming forward in space. Also, the highlight that he had in there, which you can see there's a highlight all over, it's a little on the shiny side. Matt might have been going for making him look shiny because he's in the desert, maybe he's sweating. If that's not what he was going for, which I'm actually going to kind of assume that's not what he was going for, so I guess indulge me in assuming that. I would say that the highlight that hits at the top here that he had before should be a little softer. Actually, let's put this on its own layer so I can knock it back. So let's just put it in hard so that we get that cut right there that we're looking for, and then use a big soft eraser and just knock that way back. So there, what we're doing now is we're emphasizing that the light is hitting that bicep, but if we merge these two together, you'll see the difference between them. So this is what it was before. The highlight was a little in the wrong spot and the shadow was a little soft, and then we've brought in a little bit of a tightening up of that geometry right there to try and fix that. The head height, that's something I haven't talked about yet here. This is a link adjusted for the head height of Ganon, as I've done in the past. Oh, let's erase this. As I've done in the past, let's go ahead and bring out the red. There we go. This is about the size of Ganon's head. Let's move it over. Okay, yeah, that's close enough. And then if we move it over to Link, that's about right as well. This is, of course, you know, accounting for the fact that his skull is actually more like there, not the big fullness of his hair. And so if we look at this as the right head height, it feels pretty good. I mean, Ganon doesn't feel wildly stylized, like he's super huge, but he definitely feels like he would be imposing. I mean, if you walked up to somebody on the street that was that much taller than you, it'd be pretty imposing. Now, some things that I think, if I'm gonna read into Matt's design a little bit here, he looks like he's trying to make Ganon and Link the same race, like maybe they're both Hylian, maybe they're not both Hylian. So if I'm wrong there, then that's just something I'm assuming that maybe is wrong. We've got this ear shape and this ear size here that isn't the same as what we've got going on with Link over here. If we take that ear and we move it over, it's definitely much bigger on Link. That said, I think it looks pretty ridiculous on Ganon. So maybe this is just something where we're saying, okay, well, even if he is the same race, maybe these ears can be different sizes and his are a little bit smaller because it makes him look a little bit more hardcore. He doesn't have these big, goofy ears, which, I mean, that is somewhat goofy. Let's just see what that looks like, actually. So that's what he would look like if those ears were sized up, which, I mean, it could be salvaged, but it's starting to look pretty ridiculous. Something also that I'm just a little bit of a stickler for, so I'm going to address it, is ear anatomy. Now, I'm not saying I'm like the king of ear anatomy, but one thing that I think really helps sell an ear, let's lower Ganon's opacity here, is just really trying to hit a couple of key elements. One is this part that comes up here. We need this part right here. And then there's the part that curves in from like inside the ear, not inside the ear hole, but like inside the ear. And then we've got this, and I used to know all these terms like helix and this and that and the other thing, just look them up for yourself. But then we've got this bit here that curves in like that. Now this is stylized, and it's also stylized for an ear that is, you know, weird, but I think that that helps with the ear. So if I'm going to actually reconcile this now to just be a little bit more anatomically satisfying, it'd be something kind of like this. I might put like a little curve in there and then bring this around, keep that inner sort of swirl right there a little tighter, like that, and then bring that up and around and get that little divot in. So I mean, you can already see I kind of did that over here, but I left out some of the anatomy because since it was getting so big, I thought it might be interesting if it just flattened out there a little bit. Okay, so now as far as the line weights go, I think they're pretty similar. I do have a slightly darker, slightly more saturated line than what he's got going on in his, and the shadows are pretty consistent overall. They're all mostly coming from basically as if the light were like this. Actually, no, it's kind of just straight down because we've got the shadow coming from the pectoral and the bicep. We've got the shadow coming from the chin and the ear, but there are some opportunities to maybe push that a little bit further, possibly bring this down just a little bit more, maybe find an opportunity to get some shadow there if you want to. It doesn't have to be, but it could be. And I would even push the shadow from the belt a little bit harder, since we've got the sort of Ganon monster face on the belt, which I think is a really cool touch. I think that that's cool. Let's keep pushing some of this even harder and get some of these a little longer with maybe a little implication of that cool cutout pattern that's right there. That could be really nice as well. One of the things I really like about the design, just to speak to the design overall, is I like its simplicity quite a bit. This is the type of design that I almost feel like he at some point would have, like, let me grab this color here. He would have like a big coat, a big cloak, I mean, not a coat. Actually, let's go more saturated part of it. He would have almost like this big cloak that he wears. Maybe he, you know, it says Desert King. Maybe it's like this. And then right now he's got this cool dark metal, which is similar to what Link, my design of Link has. But let's just, for the sake of visual pop, say that he's got, you know, like a design on here that makes him a little king-like. Maybe it's even like shiny, like it's like a metal that's it's like a metal fabric or something like that. It's almost like he's like that a lot of the time. Maybe even has a hood or something, and then at some point that comes off when he's like ready to fight Link, and it turns out he's actually, you know, pretty tough and he could fight and all that kind of crap. And I love this metal touch, as I said, that's similar to what's going on with Link, as I referenced. We've got it right there, and here, and here. And I like that he's brought it in here, trying to hint at some amount of storytelling with that, which I think is super cool. He's got crazy eyes. Ganon usually does have crazy eyes. Maybe that's also hinting at something. So overall, that's just like some really nice touches. I do really like the red tusks here, but I like the simplicity overall. I mean, for me, that's the thing that looks really cool about this. He's iconic. His color blocking is pretty good. We've got this sort of pale orangey hair. We've got just this big block of skin. Then we've got this red and this gray, and then we're back down to skin. Now, the only thing that I would say is probably some saturation would be nice to see. If I crank up his saturation overall, I think that's probably an improvement. It's not, that's obviously just I'm just forcing it, right? But if we come in and erase away some of this intense red that's all around him, and we just try to, now he looks like he's got the glow, like it's the last dragon, Bruce Lee Roy. I think that some intensity would probably be good to pop him up a bit, especially next to Zelda. Jesus, that's the second time I did that. I swear I've been playing Zelda since I was like little, but I keep making that mistake because I think it's on my mind that it's such a mistake, and I keep doing it. So there's Link, and I think that when you put this Ganon next to this Link, he could use a little bit beefing up of value and saturation a little bit. In fact, let's do just a little bit of curves just to see if we can get a little more. Let's see, preview, boom, 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 boom. Yeah, I mean, that feels better overall. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff, like his hair is way too bright and he's really blown out in spots. But I think that if I had the raw file, I would go in and tweak a lot of these values to be a little bit stronger when going up against Link's colors. But I also like his colors overall. The red against the green, super cool. He definitely looks evil. He definitely looks like he's from the desert. I think the Egyptian, the very subtle Egyptian vibe is really cool. And I think it works quite well. So that's it. There are some anatomy things actually I want to make sure I reference, since I did some anatomy in Jonathan's piece. Is some of this anatomy here is a little off, but I'm glad that there is some anatomy there. But I would maybe strengthen some of these curves, get that elbow popping out, and then when the bicep comes in, cut the bicep off a little bit and bring this around. So if we lower the opacity on, whoops, wrong one, on that, I think that's starting to build up a better structure for the arm than what's underneath there. Same thing with the hand. get that hand anatomy working a little bit better. And I think the overall pose starts working a little bit better when some of that gets reconciled. That's actually not even that great. That could be improved, I think, pretty significantly if I just flatten that out a little bit more and start to get like a bit of a better fist going on there. But again, this is super fast draw over, but I think that starts reconciling that whole arm just a little bit better. And I'd like to thank everyone who submitted to the Zelda Redesign Challenge. I think all of the results were awesome, and I especially want to thank the 3 in this video for subjecting themselves to my ridicule. Just excellent designs all around, and I thank everyone who participated. And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video or any of the other videos, please consider hitting like, hitting subscribe, hitting the bell, just like hit everything on the screen and just see what happens. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.